Friends, well, whether you're joining us in person or if you're joining us online, I would like to welcome you to St. Andrew's United Church here at Yonge and Bloor. My name is Morgan Bell, and along with Reverend Neil Young, I'm one of the ministers here. And we are super delighted to have with us the Reverend Dr. Natalie Wigg-Stevenson, who I will further introduce in a moment. So we are delighted to have Natalie with us. Natalie is the Associate Professor of Contextual Education and Theology at Emmanuel College, which is a United Church-affiliated theological school at the University of Toronto. Natalie's an ordained Baptist minister. She's a graduate of Vanderbilt University, that august institution, and she's the author of 2 books. The first one is called Ethnographic Theology, so literally wrote the book on her discipline. And then the second just came out last year, I suppose, correct?
I think 2 years ago.
2 years ago.
Yeah.
And it's called Transgressive Devotion, Theology as Performance Art. Why don't we start with a quick prayer? Okay. The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Gracious God, we thank you that we can worship you with our bodies and our hearts and our wills and our intellects. And so be with us now as we bend the knee of our intellect before you. Fill this place with your Spirit and guide us into closer communion with you. All this we pray in the name of the risen and living Son, Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
So I teach the first queer theology course that's ever been taught at the Toronto School of Theology, which is a little mind-boggling to me. But and the way that I try to explain it to my students is that this is a very different discipline than, say, doing what used to be called gay and lesbian studies, which were focused primarily on trying to create different kind of theological understandings that open the church up to inclusion of people who would embody some kind of queer identity. Queer theology differs from that, not that in that it's not affirming, it is affirming, but that's its baseline, and it moves quickly away from that in terms of trying to reimagine how we conceive of the divine through the kinds of language Christianity has always used to conceive of and relate with the divine. If we were to remove from that all the kind of heteronormative, all the kind of heterosexual underpinnings of all theological thinking, and then to reimagine with a wider diversity of human sexuality and gender diversity. The thing that excites me about queer theology is that our desire for God is kind of at the heart of Christian faith. Our desire for and our yearning towards the divine is the core of how we love God. It's a drawing, it's a luring. God is always reaching towards us, and we are reaching back towards God. And that's, to me, at the heart of queer theology, this idea of desire for the divine that we then begin to understand in many, many different ways. If you think throughout Christian history of the ways desire for God has been understood, it's always had a very heterosexual orientation to it. And queer theology kind of takes that, affective orientation to the divine and begins to open it up to really think about all the ways that humans can experience desire and desire for God in ways that are, as the name goes, queered, among other things.
You talk about some of your work in queer theory and how that helps us understand this affective orientation of theology, of Christian life. What does our desire and all of that have to do with a God who desires us?
Yeah, so part of what Morgan's pulling out here is that in this book I wanted to push not just on sort of conservative, anti-queer kind of approaches to theology, but also on liberal approaches to theology as well, that wanted to shy away from sort of the terror and the fear and the wonder and the majesty of God. And part of what had happened, at least in earlier classical feminist theologies, was this kind of moving away from any idea of God as sort of all-powerful. This became seen as sort of a sadomasochistic divine who just wanted to control us. And this quote from John Donne's poem, what is the poem? Batter my heart, three-person God. Three-person God, yeah. It became kind of a touchstone piece that people would criticize of, well, John Donne wants to be beaten up by God, and therefore that's bad. And I was like, well, what if John Donne was actually just a little to something a bit more kinky, and was, it's not that he wants to be beaten up by God in a bad way, but maybe wants to enjoy a certain kind of awareness of the power dynamics between the divine and the human. And that this queerness, this kinkiness to the poem that he's writing actually lifts that up. And instead of saying we have to choose between God is either all-powerful and that's a terrible thing, or God is not really into power, me and God, we're kind of like the same. On the other side, there's this in queer theology, there's this interest in actually really heightening these power dynamics in the same way as happens in certain forms of kink and queer kind of play. And so I'm interested in using those kinds of approaches of thinking about power in a queered way to understand the divine-human relationship. I yearn for God. I yearn for God. I am a former charismatic evangelical, still kind of one, progressive, whatever. I don't even know what I would name myself as. But that old world I come from, they knew a really powerful, terrifying, and desiring God. And I don't want to let that God stay just there. I want to know that God from my progressive politics as well.
But it's more than just sort of contemporary charismatic Christianity, right? This goes back through the Christian tradition. So you've written a bit on Beatrice of Nazareth, who, for those of you who might not know, she's a 13th century Flemish nun, am I right? A Cistercian nun?
Yes.
Yes. If you see this on the internet later, can you Google it for us and then get back to us?
And then just put it in the comments if I just got it wrong.
That's right. And so you write this in your book about just these power dynamics and the mix of desire with them. So on Beatrice, you write, Eucharistic starvation, bodily restriction and bondage, piercing her flesh with thorns. Beatrice is known for her ruthless asceticism. She pursued discomforting mixtures of desire and violence, pleasure and pain, and spirit unleashed through broken flesh that presage the Marquis de Sade's dungeons and serve as templates for contemporary communities of BDSM practitioners. 50 Shades of Grey pales in comparison to Beatrice's piety. You want to unpack that, Natalie Wick-Stevenson?
Morgan said we were going to start kind of slow. I'm really worried about what's coming in the second hour. Yeah, well, there is a tradition throughout Christian history among who we typically would refer to as mystics or ascetics, people who take on these extreme bodily practices to form their bodies in a way that are open, transcendent to divine presence. And they always used incredibly erotic language that often gets cleaned up in translations or cleaned up by sort of the parameters that get put around the text when it's published. But at the heart of these stories are people just yearning to the point of self-destruction for the divine. And I'm not saying everyone needs to be this way in the same way that, like, it's okay.
Don't try this at home.
But there are practices these people have taken on throughout history that do look like contemporary kink practices in many ways, and there's a lot of philosophical work done on trying to look at the similarities among these, that are disciplining the body into forms of transcendence that open awareness and connection with the divine. But I mean, even right now, I'm sweating a little talking about this because I'm like, well, actually, maybe a lot of people don't like to get smacked around in the bedroom or at the pulpit, right? Not everybody is into that, and not everybody has to be. But what intrigues me are the ways in which these certain kinds of practices throughout history have enabled people to transcend their own, let's say, bodily or self-coherence in ways that open them up to the inexplicable, unexplainable, unimaginable. And I don't think everyone needs to be doing that. I mean, this is why queer theology is less about inclusion and trying to sort of draw everyone into a normative way of being, and much more about seeking to disrupt what our norms are, to see when we do that, what kind of possibilities open up for how we might relate to God. And so it's always a bit, I'm like thrown off a bit because we've jumped straight into the BDSM and kink, which I thought we were going to sneak in at the end. But the idea...
Lay it all on the table.
It's right out there. The idea here being is that we have these kinds of ways of thinking theologically, of constructing our Christian practice, of approaching God that are shaped by certain kinds of parameters of what we might call decency, what the theologian Marcella Altuis-Reed calls decency. And that if we want to really unlock our theological imaginations to open up new ways of encountering the divine, it requires becoming indecent in a certain way. And that attached to sexual decency also come certain ideas of economic decency, colonial decency. We can list all the things that us good liberals care about decency. They're all sort of connected with each other. And when you can break open the sexual story, you become able to also break open all these other stories as well that, like I say, open our theological imaginations for the possible. So what can be quite tricky, and I often forget to kind of frame when I'm talking about queer theology, and often I have TAs who help remind me that this part's important too when I'm freaking out students, that these are not suggestions for how one has to live. I'm not knocking them. I can see on some of your faces, some of you like these suggestions. It's a nice way to spend a Tuesday afternoon. But they're not only... It's Wednesday today, isn't it?
I'm going to have to find a new church tomorrow.
Not talking about what I did yesterday. You're pouring the water now. They're not suggestions for what you have to do. But they're ways of thinking about the divine. If we destabilize the kind of normative underpinnings of the ways we think about God, many new things become possible. And when we're thinking about God in different ways, we're relating to God in different ways. And for me, I'm always wanting to think about and relate to God through yearning, deep, deep and wild yearning, because I believe that God yearns deeply with great desire for me. Yeah. Us, not just me, but me. And you.
I mean, we did jump right into sort of the kinky BDSM stuff, right? But I think that helpfully kind of puts on the table that we are not about a decent enterprise tonight. It's kind of an indecent enterprise. Yes. But there's been some critique of queer theology precisely on that score. It's shock and awe for shock and awe's sake, right? What would you say to that? That there can be some pretty explicit messaging in queer theology. Some parts of your book, I did some interesting Google searches to be like, what is that? And let's just say I had to clear my browser history afterwards. But that has a purpose, I think you would want to argue. And what is the purpose of that other than, disruption for disruption's sake? How do you do that in a judicious way, right? I'll let you go for that.
I think people do it, many queer theologians do it differently. One thing that I think is particularly interesting about queer theology that we've talked about, so Morgan was actually, I think he was still an MDiv student when I wrote the draft of this book. And yes. Morgan is one of the smartest students I've ever had and a really incredible reader. And so I gave him the draft and said, could you give me some feedback on this, please? And he gave me actually fairly intimidating feedback. It was very insightful. But one of his first...
I was terrified of Natalie for 4 full calendar years, so favor returned.
I'm so nice. But one of the first things he said was, like, his generation has just had, I think, like a fire hose of sexuality thrown at you since you were born. He's like, but you're really orthodox. I had no idea. Like, the shock level for him, and it has been for other people as well in reading some of my work, is that I'm incredibly doctrinally orthodox. And that's kind of the bringing together of these really deep, historical, rich wisdom traditions with these potentially shocking ways that some people live their lives. It unlocks, I think, this new possibility of encounter. A lot of queer theologians do work with deeply traditional approaches to theology because they give us these kind of, those of you who do know about kink and BDSM will hear where this is going, but they give us these fairly strict structures and parameters that you can then rupture and rearrange in different ways to actually create spaces of performance, activity, creativity, where a divine encounter becomes possible. I'm not especially interested, and might be where I differ from some queer theologians, I'm not particularly interested in writing about God. I'm interested in writing spaces through which God will make Godself known. Okay. Yeah, so that rupture, what it does is it takes something really solid, breaks it apart to release the spirit, to create this transcendent moment of what's possible. I'm trying to think theologically, I don't want to shock you with BDSM, but there's something where if you went home and now and began to think about God's power and began to think of it along the lines of certain kinds of sexual practices that we never talk about in church, and that are certainly not sanctioned by church, then it would start to ripple out and begin to have a systematic effect on the way that you think about God. That's what I'm looking for, something that is powerful enough to actually rearrange the whole system we have moving subconsciously in our minds and under the surface of our bodies to see what can happen when you rearrange it. I came up with this little set of criteria. And those guys were my ancestors. They were my ancestors in Christ. And they gave me a set of really good questions to keep asking in different contexts. And so I want to take those ancient questions and ask them now in light of gender diversity that we are beginning to understand, in light of sexual diversity, in light of practices around desire, less interested in identities and more interested in practices. How through certain practices do we become shaped as lovers of God? That's what excites me, and that's what I think those ancient questions, they become authoritative for me because they give me something outside of myself and outside of my time and outside of my space to keep asking questions I would never think of on my own. They bind me to something that I wouldn't choose in and of my single selfness. They push me into ways of relating that I wouldn't pick on my own. In a good way.
Why would churches care about queer theology? What would a queer theology in practice look like in a congregation?
That's a great question. I mean, why are you here tonight? We're doing this sort of esoteric thing of talking about queer theology tonight. You probably would get more people if we were having a town hall on how to be more inclusive, because that's where the church's conversations are mostly happening. And again, very, very important conversations. I cannot state enough how much I think it's important for churches to be inclusive and affirming. The queer theological conversation often doesn't happen in the everyday life because it's the place where it wants to be more disruptive of that. So I teach queer theology to my students because I have students coming in who think that being inclusive and affirming is the end of the story. We've done that now. We've put on our pride flag. We're good, let's go. And I want to work with students to say, you know what, actually, things are changing constantly. You need tools to be thinking beyond. We've decided to let this narrow, understood group of particular queer people into the church, provided they get married, provided they do this, that, and that, and they don't talk about this or that. Queer theology is trying to be more continually disruptive than that. Queer not as an identity, but as a verb, as a continual challenge to a form of sexual status quo and gendered status quo. So I don't know. I don't know how well it sort of slides quickly into everyday church life, because I think it's a lens, a critical lens on trying to disrupt us when we think we've made it. Queer is to queer. It's to make strange what we have accepted as no longer strange. I'm trying to think about how to pull that back into my mouth so it doesn't sound offensive, or to add the words to make it sound less offensive, but it's an attempt to continually push and say, don't get comfortable thinking you figured it out. There's someone you're still forgetting. There's something you're still forgetting. There's something that's still possible. There's something that's still open. And for inclusion, but also, again, for relating to God. There are things happening in people's lives that we don't know about, where they're having these wild encounters with the divine, and this widening of our understanding of sexuality opens up space for that. So I don't think I sort of, my students will often say, well, how am I going to preach that? I'm like, I don't know how you're going to preach that. It's not...
You're the student, you figure it out. Yeah.
It's not direct from here to the pulpit, but if I'm helping to equip ministers who are thinking in much more expansive and disruptive ways about sexuality, then they're going to be, like I do when I preach, dropping little things into the sermon that might not sound like they're about sex or identity or gender, but are, again, sort of thinking about desire, thinking about ecstasy, right? Who thinks about ecstasy anymore in church? I'm always trying to preach ecstasy. I want to unlock and overflow and pour out and spill all over the place. I don't know if you're into that at St. Andrews, but that's the stuff that's been shaped by my queer theological imagination. It's a more ecstatic relationship with the divine. I think that's where it comes into daily church life, of giving people permission to overflow, be too much. Yeah, I wanted to get students thinking about what their edge was. So someone help us. What's the name of this movie where Ryan Gosling has an affair with a real doll? Lars and the Real Girl. Oh, so I was using that 12 years ago when I first came to Emmanuel. And back then it was quite radical. He's having this relationship with this doll and... Sorry, do you all know the movie? Okay, some do.
Consider yourselves lucky.
Oh my God, it was one of Ryan.
It was weird.
Well, I stopped using it because it just seems too normative at this point. But and the church is the most embracing community in this movie, which is quite lovely. And so we were talking about how the church becomes inclusive of this young man who's having a romantic relationship with a doll, a very realistic-looking doll. But so maybe it was after you, I began pairing it with a documentary about the men who do this in real life. And all of a sudden, the students who felt like they were so much more open-minded with the Ryan Gosling version had to face the real-life guys who were doing this. And then we got to see 5 of them who were doing it. And one was a very sweet story. A couple were upsetting. And all of a sudden, we had to start saying, okay, well, where's my edge? Right? If I'm okay with Ryan Gosling doing it, and in the Ryan Gosling movie, it is also like they start to use some pathologizing stuff around him that can explain it away. But what happens when we see that this is an actual sexual practice that some people engage? Then how does our inclusion become shaped and reimagined by that? Okay, I've gone down the real doll.
I think
So asking students to actually name not what are my norms so much, but how do I know when I've hit them? How do I articulate them and how do I use them? When I've decided that something is beyond my boundaries of comfort, why? And then if you can begin to understand why you're applying a yes or a no to a certain point, then you can begin to understand how that might shift as well. And so I was trying to find like a very uncomfortable edge for every student. I sort of had to stop doing it because when your goal is to like make everybody uncomfortable in a different way, it got problematic. But we did learn a lot about where we put our edges and why.
Yeah.
So a lot of queer theory is happening in places like literary theory, art theory. So there's not necessarily like a body of the queer theory so much as in different disciplines, scholarly disciplines, people are trying to queer, meaning disrupt, reimagine, change, bring these sexual lenses to their particular discipline. And as they do that, as we do that, we've begun to find all the many different ways in which this idea of a heterosexual nuclear family shapes so many of the ways that we move through the world and so many of the ways we understand what it is to be in a human body in the world, be a human body in the world. So one is time. One is how we relate to time. There's the idea that this forward drive of time, sort of this heterosexual intersection with capitalism that is always kind of pushing us into a certain set of sexual and economic norms. The disruption to that kind of drive is interesting to me because it removes the idea that things are always getting better, that we're progressing towards something better, that what we should be doing is producing, whether we're producing products or babies. I find that interesting because in Christian history, we've also had a very wacky relationship to time. We live between a beginning and an end, and the end is somehow punctuating the space between the beginning and the end and reshaping it as it goes. We are time travelers as Christians, and
Someone tweet that, please. Yeah.
So we need different ways to think about time, to be faithful Christians. I think that we do. We have promises of what's possible, but it's not among us yet. There's a tension in our life. That is an understanding of how it means to live in time that is very different than the dominant understanding of our culture. And it's fascinating to me that queer theorists are finding the same playing with the same ideas to think about how do we live in time differently. This is something Christians should be thinking about. Queer theology is exploring this and thinking, how do we relate to the traditions that shape us as Christians? How do we relate to the cultural context that we're in? How are we relating or not relating to the future? Where even is the future? These are the kinds of questions it's stirring up. Again, they don't preach directly, I don't think, but you got to think about time if you're a Christian. I think the relationship between Christian theology, because you took us back to the BDSM and kink stuff. Putting Christian theology side by side with queer theory lifts the questions of each out to ask the other. And so, for example, in Christian theology, we've had a long-standing conversation around power, God's power, human power, God's agency, human agency, and kind of maybe needed some more resources for thinking about that. At the same time, in queer theory, you're getting questions arising about power and power differentials and how to think about power. Feminist theory having a lot of concerns about patriarchal power that became sort of kink shaming. And then in queer theory, moving into thinking about power through kink and BDSM practice. So this is where the conversation starts to become interesting, because you've got a set of sexual practices that think about power in a certain way and give us a lot of good material and theory and thinking and structuring to use then and bring to the divine human relationship, which is also a power and balanced relationship. So it's when you get these similar questions across the divide, they become helpful. This is how this relates to the public-private. So on the one hand, you could have a fantastic church movement for embracing kink-positive practices. I don't know, is there like a queer... There are kink Christian community dungeon places. Like there are places where you can go and have a community of Christians doing kinky stuff together. And
the bus leaves in front of the church at 9 o'clock.
no, they're sex clubs. There's sex clubs for Christians. And so, yes, that's one version of it. And then the private version can become, if you're a kink practitioner, maybe there's something in there that's helping you think through your relationship with God that would let you take on a new kind of power-laden prayer practice. If you're not a kink practitioner, there's still insight there for thinking about, I'm struggling with how I think about divine power in my own life, how I think about the agency of God and myself being an agent in relation to this being who has so much more power than I do. I've run out of resources for that, but look, here I can think about this kind of set of sexual practices that opens up new lenses for thinking about that. That might be something that someone takes on in their own private prayer life as well. So there's the public and the private can run across all of this, but the idea that we're having different resources to support the questions these different communities are asking is, I think, something that we've missed saying out loud so far. There are tons of resources for people wanting to think about different queer practices in a way that's not sensationalizing or exoticizing of them, but actually listening to people who do these practices and what it means for them, right? Don't go to 50 Shades of Grey. Go to like real kink practitioners. We're so close to Church Street. Go to a workshop. Like there's communities that we can learn from and be in relationship with or be committed members of that can expand our understanding in ways that, again, are not like the 50 Shades version. But, if something's ignited your imagination tonight about BDSM and prayer, there are resources out there for you to solve.
I know a book.
So, you can, it's what's captured your imagination. But dive into your own, explore yourself. I cannot believe this is how this is coming out. What are your fantasies? What excites you that you don't say out loud to people? I'm not going to pass around the mic, but how is your desire constituted in ways that aren't sanctioned by the church? What do you think about when you're not allowed to be thinking about that thing? And if that's how your desire works, what does that tell you about your desire for God and God's desire for you? What if we haven't put anything outside of the pale of God's desire for us? What if whatever happens in your most secret, scary fantasies that you're not going to tell to anyone but God, what's happening in those? What do those tell you about who you are? Because the way we experience our desire is a part of that repertoire that Judith Butler is talking about when we constitute ourselves. What does that unlock in the depths of who you are? What if God felt the same way? That thing that you can't tell anybody else, and was willing to meet you in that. It'd be really good.